These Tarkir Dragonstorm precons are some of the most synergistic I've seen in a long time. They really took their time making these lists. However, I've gone through all 5 of them, and I have got a few cards that we can cut and a few cards that we can add on a budget to make these instantly more competitive right out of the box. Check the timeline at the bottom of the video for the exact deck that you want, but do me a favor, even if you don't want to watch the whole video, click that like and subscribe button and share this with a friend who might find it useful as well. That helps tremendous. And after watching all the upgrades, if you're still not sure which one you want to buy, stick around to the end and I'll rank all of them against each other and hopefully help you make that decision. So many thanks to our Patreon supporters. Your support keeps Jake and Joel Magic going, helping us create in-depth content and work on exciting new projects. If you want to join and get exclusive perks, early access, and a say in future videos, go check out our Patreon and get involved with our community on a deeper level. Jake and Joel Magic is brought to you by Card Conduit, the best place to sell your cards quickly and easily on the internet. TCG Players, the best place to buy them. Dragon Shield's the best way to protect them. And Moxfield's the best place to go to put your deck lists and what you'll see in the video today. Let's start with the Abzan Armor deck, and look, I've chosen one commander, obviously, from each of these precons to build around. Typically, the primary and the lieutenant might have 2 different lines that you need to sort of focus on when you're building the deck, and so I just want to make that clear. I've chosen Felithar for Abzan, and you'll see my choices for the others, and you'll see the lines along which we upgrade those. So Felithar at the head of the Abzan deck, 1 green, 1 black, 1 white, 1 other, for a 0/5 that says, each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, and creatures you control can attack as though they didn't have defender. So we're going to put up a bunch of walls around ourselves. We're going to animate those walls and make them able to attack, and we don't care that things have 0, 1, or 2 power as long as they've got a nice chunky butt to help us attack and do some damage. 3 mana is the activated ability on Felithar. You tap it and sack another creature to draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness, then discard cards equal to its power. And you'll see, just at a very base level, you're running a lot of cards in here like Walking Bulwark that have a 0/3 power toughness. So if you were to sacrifice it to Felithar's ability for 3 mana, you're drawing 3, you're discarding 0. So it's nice to keep in mind as a way that we could refill our hand if we just dump everything onto the battlefield. And it especially starts paying off when you see things like 0/7s in this deck that you can sacrifice and just draw 7 cards. Kind of insane. What we're trying to do with this deck is have big toughness creatures. Add X mana of any one color where X is the greatest toughness among other creatures you control. Rampart, Architect. Whenever a creature you control with Defender dies, you can search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So we need things with big toughnesses. We need things with Defender. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a number of +1/+1 counters on each other creature you control equal to that creature's toughness. However, we do sacrifice creatures with Felithar's ability, so let's play toward that. You've got other cards in this deck like Tip the Scales. Sack a creature. When you do, all creatures get -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed creature's toughness. I showed you that 7 toughness creature. There are not a lot of creatures with 7 toughness. -7/-7 is going to kill nearly every creature in the game. However, for us, we're running some 0/9s, some 0/10s, you know what I'm saying? That is what we're trying to do, so we could potentially survive a card like this while also sacrificing more things. We want some backup on that, and so we run cards like Reunion of the House. Return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less. Power 10 or less, remember, we're running 0s. We can just dump our walls back onto the battlefield, and we're returning those from the graveyard to the battlefield. So that's what we're trying to do with Felithar. Have chunky rear ends that are on the battlefield for us, dealing damage, able to attack even though they don't have Defender, and then if we need to refill our hand, we sacrifice one of those, and we're built for having that thing come back. One of the cool features on our sponsor Moxfield's website is that you can go and just click on View Precon Upgrades to immediately see what I've added and what I've cut. Let's go over the cards that I cut first. Arboreal Grazer. It's nice. Late, I'm not as in love with this. A lot of the other smaller walls can draw us a card or give something haste or have some other utility value. This just ramping us. It's nice to see early, really not nice to see late, and so I chopped it. Orzhov Signet, we've already got 38 lands in here. I just came down 2 mana rocks because I would personally rather put our ramp on spells that go and get lands. In this deck particularly, I want to make sure that we're ramping while we're in green. I prefer land-based ramp, and so I chop that. Jati Offshoot, again, whenever a land you control enters, you gain 1 life. just not as impactful as we want our walls to be. There are some cooler things that we can do with those types of strategies. So Arboreal Grazer and Jotty Offshoot were easy cuts from the lower end of the scale. So let's look at Indulging Patrician. There was an archetype in this deck that I nearly completely chopped out. You can choose to leave it in if you want to go with Beator as your commander, or you just want to make it more life gain centric, but I did just kind of completely surgically remove all of the life gain stuff so that we could focus on defender, big toughness, and reanimating the stuff that we end up sacrificing. Indulging Patrician came out of the deck because it was a life gain card. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained 3 or more life this turn, each opponent loses 3 life. In a life gain deck, sick. We want this. Since our chosen commander doesn't have any sort of life gain, I chopped it. This is the Lieutenant Commander from the deck, and typically I don't cut new cards, especially Lieutenant Commanders, even if they are a little bit off from the synergy. However, at the beginning of your end step, put up a number of +1 counters on up to 1 other target creature you control equal to the amount of life you gained this turn, and return up to 1 target creature card with mana value less than or equal to the amount of life you lost this turn from your graveyard to the battlefield. Beator can allow itself to start getting its synergies going because it does have lifelink, but it feels a little slow for 5 mana at that point, and it only having a 5 toughness doesn't really lend itself too strongly to our entire toughness strategy. It's only a difference of 2 between its power and toughness, so I ended up chopping it. However, you can lean this into a life gain. That was certainly a route that they provided you in the deck. I just think we can make it more focused if we chop it out completely. Ikra Shadiki, the Usurper, 5 mana for a 3/7. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. Strong. Pretty strong in a vacuum. I chopped out the life gain stuff for other stuff. I believe this was in the deck because we could have potentially been gaining so much life that we could get a lot of value off of Staff of Completion, not caring that all of its abilities cost life. So I chopped it. Wall of Limbs, whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. You can see what we did here. At the beginning of your end step with Wall of Reverence, you may gain life equal to the power of target creature you control. This one in particular doesn't really work great in our deck. Yes, it's a defender wall with a high power toughness, you know, and they're far apart in difference, so we can draw a lot of cards. However, power of creature we control, it's kind of one of those antithetical cards to our strategy, even though it fits in our strategy. I would chop this regardless of if I was doing the life gain strategy or not. I just don't like this card in this deck personally. Selesnya Signet I chopped for the same reason as Orzhov Signet. Tower Defense, I swapped out 1 for 1 with a card that I'll show you. I think that this one could potentially have play, especially if you go with a more like, we are going to leave in the Arboreal Grazer, the Jotty Offshoot. We're going to go for some more like 1 mana, 2 mana walls and try and go wide with our walls instead of playing some of the bigger creatures that this deck has in it. Tower Defense is just something that I chopped out, but it's like top of the list for me. It's definitely staying in the deck box for my first card that I sideboard back in to test out. And I'll show you the 1 card that I swapped out for it to give you a sense of why I went the route that I did. Rock's Faith Mender, if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead. And Nyx's Fleece Ram, at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain a life. Both, you can see why they fit in the strategy if you're going with big toughness life gain. We just are not. Let's take a look at the cards that I added into this deck. Tree of Perdition. We've already got the green tree in here, and I feel like if I can arguably run Tree of Perdition in a deck in Commander where it's good, I'm doing it. Tree of Perdition definitely goes in this deck. I put Reanimate in here. The cost of Reanimate has come down. This is not a card that I would suggest typically, you know, in my boomer days for a budget upgrade, but it's down to $6 as you can see right now. It's appeared in a couple of precons. It's gotten some reprints recently. This, if you're reanimating the creatures that you sacrifice to go and draw cards, you are doing the right thing. I think it belongs in here. Same thing for Rise of the Witch King. A green and black and 2 for each player sacks a creature. Beautiful. We'll sack a creature, everybody else has to sack one. But then, if you sacrificed a creature this way, you may return another permanent card from your graveyard to your battlefield. So if you leave a 1 mana, 2 mana wall in the deck, you've got it on the battlefield, sack that 2 mana wall, return any other permanent card from your graveyard to your battlefield. Holy moly, very strong spell here. And at the same time, we have forced all of our opponents to sacrifice a creature. Stone Skin is the card that I was talking about. I replaced Tower Defense with 1/1. This was just an even swap for me. It's instant speed as well because it's got flash, and it's going to give 1 creature +0/+10 instead of all your creatures +0/+5. You can see the difference in approach here. I really want to focus in on 1 creature, either drawing a ton of cards off of it when we go to sacrifice it, surviving something like Blasphemous Act, or I'll let that one through. Sure, okay, plus 10+10, essentially, with our commander on the battlefield, because things are dealing damage equal to their toughness instead of their power. So I like a card like Stone Skin in here for me personally. You can choose if you want to go more tall or if you want to go more wide. Doran the Siege Tower is the commander for this deck. In the Boomer days, Doran the Siege Tower is now a 99 version of it, because it's essentially the same thing, except our new commander also lets our defenders attack and gives us the activated ability to sack things and draw some cards. Catapult Fodder is a card that you've never thought about running, and that's why I love it. I love decks like this, that the strategy is so weird and just like individualistic, that we get to run cards that you typically would not see in Commander, and that's Catapult Fodder. 3 mana, 1/5 at the beginning of combat on your turn if you control 3 or more creatures, and it includes this one, that each have toughness greater than their power. We transform Catapult Fodder. So we only need 2 other on the battlefield that have toughness greater than power, and we're ready to roll to transform this into some redundancy. Well, kind of. It's another helping us get to the win here. 3 mana activated ability, tap it, sack another creature. We're ready for that. We've got some reanimation built in. Target opponent loses life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness. Ooh, baby. We got Stone Skin on something like Doran the Siege Tower. It's a 0/15. We can hit him for 15, sack him to Catapult Captain, and suddenly we've got 30 damage onto one opponent in that turn. Wow. Really like Catapult Fodder and Catapult Captain. I think it's super fun. Ancient Lumber Knot. Each creature you control with toughness greater than its power assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. That should seem familiar. You want all these effects, y'all. You do not want to be caught flat-footed with this deck, and what I mean by that is your commander gets killed, and suddenly you've got a bunch of 0/5s in your deck, and you're like, how do I possibly win this? We need some backup. We need some redundancy. That's why we're running cards like Doran. That's why we're running cards like Ancient Lumber Knot. Path to Exile. Let's run Path to Exile in a deck that doesn't have it. It's one of the best removal spells in Commander. 3 visits in Nature's Lore. I replaced the signets with these. I want to be able to fix a little bit better and a little more consistently. $1.97 and $6 for these 2 ramp spells. Also got Farseek in here. I just felt like for a green deck, we need to be ramping with this. There's nothing in particular that's pushing us toward artifacts over lands, and so I just want to run land ramp in here. Past that, I put another reanimation spell with Unburial Rites. I like the black-white reanimator here. 5 mana is, it's an old rate. Typically, it's 4 mana to return a creature, but this one's going to let you do 2 because you can flash it back for that 4 mana. A white and 3 flashes back, and you get another creature card back from your graveyard to your battlefield. And then Bedrock Tortoise. I was talking about redundancy. As long as it's your turn, creatures you control have hexproof, great, but each creature you control with toughness greater than its power assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, making sure that we are just not completely out of the game if our commander is removed repeatedly. Taking a look at Jeskai Striker. We've got Shiko and Narset at the head of this one. A white, a red, a blue, and 1 for a 4/4 human spirit dragon with flying and vigilance. It's got Flurry. It says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy that spell if it targets a permanent or player, and you can choose new targets for the copy. And if you don't copy a spell this way, draw a card. You want cards that say target, even if it is something that is beneficial for you. Like I'm putting this spell in here because it says draws 2 cards. You want it to pick the spells as much as you can that say target player draws 2 cards, even though you're targeting yourself, because if it's our second spell and it's targeting us, we'll get to copy that and we get to draw more cards. And that's kind of the route we want to go. The other ways are obvious here. If it's a removal spell, you can copy that. If it's a pump spell, you're copying that. What you're trying to do is really get multiple spells casted per turn, and you want your stuff to target. Voracious Bibliophile is a good example of stuff that targets. Whenever you cast a spell with 1 or more targets, draw that many cards. That's perfect. We want our things to target, and we want to be casting spells. Caldera Pyramaw. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a +1 counter on this, then this creature deals damage equal to its power to target opponent. So if we can cast 3 instants or sorceries after we've got Pyramaw on the battlefield, it deals 4 and then 5 and then 6. That's 15 damage off of 3 spell casts once you've got Caldera Pyramaw on the battlefield. It's a pretty straightforward Jeskai spell casting deck past that. Will of the Jeskai says 4 mana, choose 1. If you control a commander, you can choose both. Each player may discard their hand and draw 5 cards, so that's wheeling, getting us refilled so that we can just keep casting and storming off. And each instant and sorcery in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn, so you can use this stuff again. By the way, side note, love that they just dropped Mana Geyser in this deck. This is a really strong card that can help you ramp and just win the game. It's a very, very sweet inclusion in here. I also really love Transforming Flourish. It's sort of like Chaos Warp. It's got Demonstrate, so you can automatically copy it if you give somebody else a copy of it. Destroy target artifact or creature you don't control, and if that permanent is destroyed this way, its controller exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land, and then they can cast that card without paying its mana cost. It's always going to find a non-land, so something's going to happen, but destroying an artifact or creature there, letting it be copied, copying it with your commander potentially, very strong. And then cards like Aligned Heart. You'll see some other things in here that are creating these prowess tokens so that we can go wide, prowess up our line, and then start attacking. When you cast a non-creature spell, something with prowess gets +1 and +1 until end of turn. And the Aligned Heart says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you put a rally counter on this enchantment. Then you create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess for each rally token on it. So really strong going wide. You can see we've got 13 sorceries, 18 instants in this deck. So we are very much trying to cast spells, whereas with our creatures, we're typically around 20, and most of them are utility stuff, as you'll see when we view our pre-con upgrades. So let's look at the cuts that we did make. Tempest Technique is a card that I really like and may be good in here, but I don't have a lot of enchantments in here, and I know we're supposed to storm off with this, but even if we storm 4, 5, 6, this is a 4 mana aura that will pop on and give them like +4, 5, 6 if we can cast it after that. I know it can go crazy if you really storm off, but even with the storm ability on here, I feel like I want this in an enchantment deck. Let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree with me on that. Curse of Opulence is a card that I wanted to chop out. There was a little bit of this like anti-tech in here for cursing people or for goading things that aren't ours. I didn't see the need for it, quite honestly. We can just remove stuff, or we can use our spells more toward instants and sorcery so that we can be triggering, hopefully, our commander as much as possible, as long as they target, of course. Curse of Opulence just isn't something that I think is super relevant in this deck. It lets us ramp a little bit and it gets some focus on the other players, but it's an easy chop for me, so we can lean more toward our synergies. Velamachus is cool. 5/5 for 7 flying Vigi haste attacks. Look at the top 7, cast an instant or sorcery for free as long as it's 5 mana or less. That could be really strong, but I wanted to drive the overall converted of this deck down a little bit, and so I chopped out the 7 mana Elder Dragon. Rider Replication is kind of cool. It's a 4 mana copy spell. It only creates a token, which I don't really love, but it's got the upside of kicker, and it does target, so it can get copied with our commander. It's just something that I personally don't really love this card ever. I want to know what I'm doing with my cards. I'm a very consistent type of deck builder, and so we could choose to copy a target creature that we already control, but for me it's a chop. This one does too little for how much it is. 8 mana, 4 damage, tap 2 things, create a 4/4, draw 2. Man, Jeskai and Izzet really love spells like this that cost a lot, do a lot of a little stuff, and I just have never really loved this card. I chop it. This can target, so it can get doubled, but draw 2, discard 2, doesn't net us any cards. And the only other thing I really want to do on here is destroy artifacts, and we can do that in better ways. Think twice. Casting just to draw and then flashbacking it for more mana just to draw, it only replaces itself. I want to net some cards. There's better options, and so I chop this. I'd rather be casting things that target, that remove, that, you know, redirect, but we can get multiple copies of. I just don't like Shiny Impetus. Ghostly Prison is a way so we can keep attacking and not have to worry too much about crackback. I just want to stay aggressive with this deck, so I chopped it. Curse of the Swine, exiling creatures. This is one where you just got to dump mana into it. You can get it copied. We get to choose new targets, and so you only have to spend like half the mana that you would typically do, but it's just not for me. And then Mangara the Diplomat. Seems like it's our strategy, but in reverse. Whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more attacking you, you draw a card, and whenever an opponent casts their second spell, you get to draw a card. I would just rather be leaning further into our strategy than waiting on our opponents to do things. Chaos Warp, this is what I'm talking about. Let's get this sort of removal spell being copied. I can't believe it wasn't in the deck in the first place. Definitely belongs in here. Stella Lee can be sort of a backup redundancy commander for you in this deck. I play Stella Lee from the Thunder Junction Precons. It's one of my favorite decks going right now. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, exile a top card of your library until the end of your next turn. You can play that card. And you can tap Stella to copy an instant or sorcery if you've cast 3 or more spells this turn, which is something that you're going to be doing with this deck. Reality Shift, one of the best removal spells in blue. It targets, you can copy it, it's great. Hinata, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target. Boom. Spells your opponents cast cost 1 more for each target. Another sort of lieutenant commander for this deck that plays along with those strategies. Boros Charm, target creature gains double strike until end of turn, and we can copy that with a backup of you control creatures permanents you control gaining indestructible end of turn. I really like that in this deck. Snap is going to let us get to that second spell and still have resources to do it. We get to bounce something, potentially time walk one of our opponents, and untap the 2 lands that we used for this so that we're ready to go and cast that second spell and start getting stuff going. Or if we want to copy this, we can make it our second spell, return 2 things. We're untapping 4 lands. It's good either way. Stroke of Midnight's another removal spell. I think this is just a good deck for more removal than it had out of the box. Destroy any non-land permanent. Boom. They get a 1/1. We don't care. They ran swords. They didn't run path. We're putting path in. That's pretty consistent across all upgrades for me. If it's got white and they're only running one of either swords or path, we put the other one in. And if they're not running either, we put both of them. Stormcatch Mentor. You'll see a couple of other cards in the deck like this already. This one's just from Bloomborough and does a very similar thing. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast is what we care about. We don't care too much about the haste and the prowess on the 1/1. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a counter on Crom, who's a flyer, and draw a card. We like that part even more. It's great. It can become a threat in the air, but drawing cards over and over again to keep our hand full as we're storming off, huge. And then Thunderclap Drake is a card from the Stella Elite Precon that I really loved. Instants and sorceries you cast cost 1 less to cast. We want that in as many places, on as many permanents as we can possibly get. And it's got this ability to 3 and sack it whenever you cast your next instant or sorcery this turn. Copy it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. So we're at least copying it once, most likely, sometimes twice, which is pretty sweet. Mardu Surge is our aggro red, white, black deck with Zergo's Stormrender. It's a 3/3 orc warrior for Mardu colors. Mobilize 1, which means whenever this creature attacks, you create a tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature token that has to get sacked at the beginning of the next end step. And Zergo also says whenever a creature token you control leaves the battlefield, draw a card if it was attacking. Otherwise, each opponent loses a life. So if our creature tokens die in combat, we get cards for that. And if they die any other time, just for being a creature token and for dying, we're going to drain each opponent by 1 life. Pretty sweet Zergo's Stormrender ability here. If you played the Mardu deck from Fallout that had to do with creature tokens and attacking, these decks have a lot in common. Enoch Strike Leader is a card they included in here. Whenever you attack with this creature and or your commander for each opponent, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. And you can sack Enoch Strike Leader to give creature tokens we control indestructible until end of turn. So we can see where the strategies are starting to lay. Whenever this creature attacks, for each creature token you control that entered this turn, create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that, and then we got to sacrifice those at the beginning of the next end step. So we're really adding to our token total. And remember, because of Zergo, if he's on the battlefield, when they die, we either draw cards if they were attacking, or our opponents lose life if they weren't. Bone Devourer says this creature enters with a number of +1 counters on it equal to the number of creatures that died this turn. So we want those tokens to be dying. We don't necessarily want to go wide permanently so much as we want to constantly be creating and destroying as many creature tokens as we possibly can. Further, Bone Devourer says when this creature dies, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of counters on it. So those creatures get further turned into cards as we continue on. You can see it in cards like Will of the Mardu, 3 mana, choose 1. If you have a commander on the battlefield, you can choose both. Create a number of 1/1s equal to the number of creatures target player controls. We'll probably target ourselves with this, but potential more upside if we got a token deck across the battlefield from us that's doing better. And Will of the Mardu deals damage to target creature equal to the number of creatures we control. So we can take down a big creature if we've got a big board. Then I also really love the card Within Range in this deck. When it enters, you create 2 1/1s, and whenever you attack, each opponent loses life equal to the number of creatures attacking them. So you can see the line is pretty straightforward here. Create creature tokens, attack with them, deal some damage, draw some cards, and deal some more damage if they die outside that. Let's take a look at the cards that I cut from this deck. I cut 10 and added 10. Lingering Souls, there's a couple of cards in here that specifically just create creature tokens, and I think we can do better. I cut Lingering Souls. It can total create 4 1/1 flyers for 5 mana. Not terrible. Solemn Simulacrum is just a generically decent creature in Commander. It doesn't really have a place with any true synergy other than like artifact creatures. Maybe some sacrifice, which is I think what the thought was here, is it'll help us fix in colors that don't fix easily, and we can sacrifice it to draw the card. It's an easy cut for me. 4 mana for 4 1/1s. Again, I just, at sorcery speed, I want more impact. I want permanents I'd rather permanents that create tokens slower but can create more value over time than having these one-off cards like Shadow Summoning. 2 mana for 2 1/1s. Even if they fly, it's fine. 3 1/1s on Siege Gang Commander for 5 mana. I still build this into token decks, but at this point, I'm feeling like, especially if it's not a goblin-centric deck, maybe Siege Gang Commander's Day in the Sun has passed. Let me know in the comments if you think that this is the right way to take this. I think that there's a better way to create creature tokens more reliably. And then Mirror Battlesphere, 7 mana. When it enters, you create the 4 1/1s, and you can do some funny tricks with those mirrors. Again, for 7 mana, I need to be doing more than just putting a Mirror Battlesphere onto the battlefield and passing. Whenever your opponents are dealt combat damage, if any of that damage was dealt by a warrior, you draw a card and lose a life. That's great. Our commander's a warrior. This is a warrior. There's some other warriors in here. They're not all warriors. This isn't a warrior kindred deck. I don't like running real kindred cards in non-kindred decks. It's a personal choice of mine. I cut the render. Beetleback Chief, when it enters, create 2 1/1s. Low impact to me, just not something I'm interested in. Our commander's 3, and then it's 5, and then it's 7. I just don't think that for 4 mana, we're going to be able to cast this particular commander enough times to get this, but there are some low mana value commanders that Commander's Insignia could really work well in. For my money, paying 4 mana to probably give our creatures +2/+2, we can do that better. And then Sun Titan. You would think that this deck would want a Sun Titan card like this, but really it doesn't. There's not a ton of mana value 3 or less in this deck. If you decide to push the curve way lower, you could run a card like Sun Titan, go with some smaller creatures that enter, create a 1/1, stuff like that. But for me, Sun Titan was an easy cut in here. Taste of Karlov. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. I don't know if you saw our commander, but he's got a pretty sweet triggered ability. And Teysa also gives our creature tokens you control Vigilance and Lifelink. Oh, baby. Yeah, I really like Teysa in here. Also really like Anam Pakal in here. Whenever you attack with one or more non-gnomes, put a +1 counter on Anam, then create X 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, where X is the number of counters on Anam. If you know, you know. I've played this in Brawl a lot. This is a commander that I frequently play. Even not being able to dump counters on Anam itself, this card can just get out of hand, doesn't have to attack, can just come down as an enchantment. Our tokens can attack as long as they're not gnomes. Trigger on them and create more tokens. Assemble the Legion. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a muster counter on it, and then create a 1/1 red and white soldier creature token with haste for each muster counter on it. This is just long-term inevitability. This is the kind of card I want to run over these like instants and sorceries that create a few creatures. I would rather take the risk that this will give us more value over time. I talked to you about the Mardu deck from Fallout, and here's the commander of it. Caesar or Kaiser, or however the hell you're supposed to pronounce it. Whenever you attack, you can sack another creature, and when you do, choose 2. Either create 2 1/1 red and white soldier creature tokens with haste that are tapped and attacking, draw a card, lose a life, or Caesar deals damage equal to the number of creature tokens you control to target opponent. You can see that's everything we want to do. We can stack the triggers so that we're creating the mobilized stuff before we go to sacrifice another creature, create even more tokens, grow our army, grow our hand, or grow the damage that we're dealing to our opponent. McCready, Lamplight Mayor, 2 mana for a 1/3. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less attacks, it gains Skulk until end of turn, which means it can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. This stops our tokens from getting chump blocked. This is fantastic. And then, just for extra value, whenever a creature with power 4 or greater attacks you, its controller loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. There you go. We are on the offense, we're on the defense. I really like this little legend. Impact Trimmers, this is how we're going to win with a deck like this. We can also call out War Leader's Call at the same time. Look, for one fewer mana than the Commander's Insignia up here, we're just getting 1/1. However, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever a creature you control enters this enchantment, deals 1 damage to each opponent. If we're creating creature tokens and they're entering and they're leaving and they're dealing damage and they're dealing damage when they're entering, we've just got so much going on, it's going to overwhelm our opponent. Elisil Core, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life. Don't care too much about that, but whenever another creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life. Putting some Aristocrats pieces on top of everything that you're trying to do in this deck adds a layer of inevitability, of a come and get me, try, destroy my board, I don't care. I've got built-ins so that even if you're wiping my stuff, Elisil Core is going to be like, well, not without some more damage coming your way. Hey, look, it's Path to Exile. Swords to Plowshares was in this deck. Path to Exile wasn't. Boom. And then a board wipe that is relevant for our entire strategy. Create X11 soldier creature tokens. If X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. We're left with a little bit of a board, and our opponent's boards are done. We've got the Sultai Arisen Precon with Codis, Sibsig Champion at the helm. A black, a green, and a blue for a 3/3 zombie warrior. Says once during each of your turns, you may cast a creature spell from your graveyard by exiling 3 other cards from your graveyard in addition to paying its other costs. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control enter, if 1 or more of them entered from a graveyard or was cast from a graveyard, you put 2+1/+1 counters on Codis. So Codis allows us to use creatures in our graveyard as though they were in our hand, as long as we have 3 other cards in our graveyard to exile when we cast that creature. So we want a lot of creatures in the deck. As you can see, we run 32 creatures in this deck, which is quite a bit, because as we're milling cards, we want our creatures to go into the graveyard, and we want to be self-milling as much as we possibly can. Citrus Supplier came in the deck. Whenever this creature enters or dies, you mill 3 cards. We're seeking that as much as possible. We want to aggressively mill our own deck into our graveyard so that we can cast creatures from there and exile the stuff that we don't need as casts as parts of doing that. Kishless Skimmer is a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever a card leaves your graveyard during your turn, draw a card. Triggers only once, but you can see what we're trying to do. We're trying to cast creatures from our graveyard. Floral Evoker. Pay a green, discard a creature card so we can cast it later. That's a good thing for us. Return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if we mill things that we don't want gone, we can get them back. Diviner of Mist. Whenever this creature attacks, mill 4 cards. So we want to be dumping the creatures in there. But then you can cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard with mana value 4 or less without paying its mana cost. That's fantastic in case we catch stuff in the crossfire as we are milling. Whenever this creature enters or attacks, mill 3 cards on Colossal Grave Reaver for an 8-mana 7/6 with flying. It mills 3 when it ETBs or attacks, and whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from your library, meaning gets milled, you put 1 of them onto the battlefield. Additionally, I wanted to highlight Afterlife from the Loam here. It's got Delve, and you'll see Delve. You see Delve right next to it there on Treasure Cruise. You'll see Delve in this deck a lot because we're going to be so aggressive with milling our own stuff, just sort of like we don't care. We want it to be milled as much as possible. Hit our best stuff, please. That's the game here. And if we don't use the things, we can delve to help cast bigger spells. Afterlife from the Loam is an 8-mana sorcery with Delve, so we can get that 5 taken care of by just exiling 5 cards. For each player, choose up to 1 target creature card in that player's graveyard. Put those cards onto the battlefield under your control, and there's zombies in addition to their other types. So you can see, that's what we're trying to do. Cards that I cut. There's a bit of a landfall theme running through this deck. The Lieutenant Commander lets you return lands from your graveyard to the battlefield, and so you can get extra landfall triggers every turn. That's not something that we necessarily need, so I ended up chopping it, so you'll see some of that in here. But I did cut Necromantic Selection. I just think this is too expensive for what it does. Destroy all creatures, then return a creature card put into a graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. I think if it said any creature card in any graveyard, so we could maybe plan for this a little bit better, I would like Necromantic Selection more, but it's got to be something off the battlefield, and so that limits us in a way that I really don't want to be limited when I'm casting a spell for 7 mana. Shigeki Jukai Visionary. Return it to its owner's hand for 2 mana to reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put a land onto the battlefield tapped, rest into your graveyard. This card is just slow to me. I've played this before. It's pretty good with landfall decks. I'll play it in a mono green deck. Just with 3 colors at our disposal here, I don't think it's necessary. Reassembling Skeleton goes in a different deck like this. We can return it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and so anything that has to do with sacrificing creatures, this is really great, but our commander doesn't really care too much about that, other than I guess we could reanimate it, but we can reanimate Reassembling Skeleton without exiling 3 cards from our graveyard, so just a big, like, kind of nothing burger in this deck, and so I ended up chopping it. Lethal Scheme is a fine Convoke Destruction spell that lets everything connive, but it's drawing, it's discarding, you can throw things into your graveyard. I just don't love where this sits with our synergy, and so I ended up chopping it. Johnicles I cut because it's a landfall card very specifically, like, decent creature to reanimate, but just that trigger once is not super impactful, but if you can get multiple landfall triggers with this creature on the battlefield, then you've got something on your hands. But since we can't, we cut it. Multani, same thing. +1/+1 for each land you control, each land in your graveyard. This could potentially see some play here as just a good generic reaching, trampling 6 mana creature, but I chopped it. Consuming Aberration, no avoidance. This is just a creature that fits into these kind of archetypes. Power toughness equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. So it doesn't even count ours, and ours is the one that we're aggressively trying to mill. So I kind of hate that, but it is what it is. Marin of Clan Neltoth, great commander. Really synergistic with the strategy here. However, with Marin, you really want to build around this because, you know, you've got some sort of death stuff in here, but with Marin, it says at the beginning of your end step, you choose target creature card in your graveyard. If its mana value is less than or equal to the number of experience counters you have, you can return it to the battlefield. And whenever another creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. This deck works best with controllable death, with a lot of sacrifice, with stuff like reassembling skeletons. So we can just get Marin on the battlefield and start sacking our skeleton, returning it over and over again. Get those experience counters up and return huge creatures at the beginning of, or at the end of every turn for us. Since we can't control it, I ended up chopping it. Keep this in there if you want to. It's not going to play too poorly. I just think that it's going to be slow in the 99 of a deck. Let me know in the comments if you agree with me on that. Woe Strider, it's a controlled sacrifice outlet. We really are not playing a sacrifice strategy other than there's some graveyard stuff, so I chopped it. And then Avenger of Zendikar, really good in a landfall deck. Really decent in other places. Thirst for Discovery. We need some card draw in here, and this one lets us fill up our graveyard as well. We can either toss a basic land card if we don't need it, or we can throw 2 creatures into the graveyard so that we can reanimate them later. Sir Conrad the Grim. Whenever a creature dies or is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad deals the damage to each opponent. We're doing a lot of this type of thing, and there's a lot of this kind of thing happening. Plus, it's got that 1 black, 1 other, each player mills a card built in, so we can just chunk mana into this creature if we're flooded, and mill stuff so that we can use our commander to return it. Mulch, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all lands revealed this way into your hand, the rest into your graveyard. This is great. It's going to go get our lands so that we're hitting our land drops, put our creatures into our graveyard so that we can get them later. Self-mill King here, Ripples of Undeath. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards. Beautiful. Then you may pay 1 and 3. If you do, put a card from among those into your hand. So if you wanted one of those cards that gets milled, you have the ability to return it. Strategic Planning. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, rest into your graveyard. This is where your card draw should be, y'all. I put multiple examples of how you can put card advantage into a deck like this so that you can see, as long as you're discarding or putting stuff into your graveyard, we are kings. This is how we succeed with this deck. Cemetery Tampering's better than people give it credit for, I think. That mill 3 at the beginning of your upkeep, that's just so good for 3 mana. When you start to build a self-mill deck, you will realize very quickly there's not a ton of ways to self-mill, to just put your graveyard into your library, because that can be a very strong ability. I love Cemetery Tampering's Hideaway of 5. You look at the top 5 when it enters, you can exile 1 face down, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you're milling 3, like I said. Then if there are 20 or more cards in your graveyard, which we should be able to execute pretty easily, you can play the exiled card without paying its mana cost, but then we just get to keep that mill 3 if we want. We get to control it as well, which is kind of sweet. Malevolent Rumble is one of my favorite commons from MH3 for decks like this. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put a permanent card from among them into your hand, which is pretty sweet. Get the creature you absolutely need right now, or just the land. Then they rest go into your graveyard, which is what we want, and you create a 0/1 that can sack to add a colorless, so we ramp a little bit at the same time. I really love Malevolent Rumble. Underrealm Lich is letting us fill up our graveyard in a different way. If you would draw a card, instead you look at the top 3, put 1 into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. That's beautiful. Then we can pay 4 life to make it indestructible if we need to get shenanigans, but Underrealm Lich first ability is why we like it here. Love Aftermath Analyst from MKM, Murders at Karlov Manor. Almost forgot the name of the set, but I didn't forget this creature because I keep building it into decks. It is a fantastic uncommon. It ETBs, you mill 3, and then later on you can pay 4, sack it, return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This can happen at instant speeds, not reduced to just sorcery, so you can do it EOT, and you are ready to play a lot of lands on your turn. Then there's also Muldrotha. This is kind of a shoe-in. This could be the commander of a deck like this, but Muldrotha is going to be more redundancy in your 99. During each of your turns, you can play a land and cast a permanent spell from each permanent type from your graveyard. We got a ton of creatures in here, so that's mostly what you're going to be recasting, but that ability to also play a land from the graveyard really helps out as well. We've got Temur Roar, which is led by Jeskai Temur's Roar, a green, a blue, and a red for a human warrior 2/2. Says whenever you cast a creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Jeskai. If that spell's power is 4 or greater, draw a card. If that spell's power is 6 or greater, Jeskai deals damage equal to Eskai's power to each opponent. Jeskai does everything. Jeskai is powerful right out of the box, ready to roll. They built this one as sort of a dragon kindred deck. So you've got Temur Dragons is essentially what you've got out of the box here. And that's what we're going to focus it around. We're just going to make this a green, blue, red dragon deck that casts a lot of creatures. You can see in this deck we got 32 creatures, yet again a huge creature count, and it's very focused around dragons. Parapet Thrasher, 2 red, 2 other for a 4/3 flying dragon. Whenever one or more dragons you control deal combat damage to an opponent, choose one that hasn't been chosen. Either destroy an artifact that opponent controls, deals 4 damage to each other opponent, or exile the top card of your library and you can play it this turn. Whenever one or more dragons you control deal combat damage, that's what we're looking for. You can look at the top card of your library at any time with Thundermane Dragon on the battlefield, and you can cast creature spells with power 4 or greater from the top of your library. You can, that's, I mean, it's very straightforward. This deck is like the most straightforward, I think, out of the box. Your Any of the Unwritten is the secondary commander in here, but we're going to keep it in the 99 as a flying trampling 7/7. When it ETBs or attacks, look at the top 8. You can put a dragon creature card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. It's so good to run this as the commander as well. I just love that every time we play a creature with power 4 or greater, we're drawing a card automatically. Jeskai can grow into an actual threat, and then when we're trying to finish the game, Eshki's going to help us try to finish the game. That's what we're trying to do. Become the Avalanche sums it up here. Draw a card for each creature you control, power 4 or greater. Then creatures you control get +X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. Y'all, this is what we're doing. Cast the big creatures, swing with the big creatures, win with the big creatures. We want to look at power 4 and 6. You know, if we're looking at creatures that are like power 3 or 5, that's a little frustrating for our commander when we cast them. It's not the worst thing in the world, and we can work around it if there's just like an incredibly strong creature that's a power 3 or a power 5 and is not going to hit our metrics here the way that we want it to, but just something to keep in mind as we go and upgrade this deck. Let's look at what I cut. I cut some dragons. Don't hate me. But look, not all of these are great. You don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases in. That's great. We're in a 3-color deck. I don't know how much we're going to be able to really take advantage of that. And so to make room for where there will be stronger dragons that we can run, I did chop some dragons, starting with Leyline Tyrant. Felwar Stone, a mana of any color an opponent controls in a 3-color deck. I want to lean on making sure that we can make our own mana, so I chop Felwar Stone for something else. Varric's Bladewing, generically good, 4/4 flyer for 4 that can become 8 power flying in the air for 7 mana. Pretty decent return there, but when you look at the amount of dragons in the game nowadays that do things on ETB or attacked, do more than just I'm a big dragon. They have an ability and they're like, hi, I'm a big dragon as well. You can start chopping stuff like this. 4 to each creature and Planeswalker is a decent board wipe in this, but I want to make sure we've got Blasphemous Act in here. We don't need a ton of redundancy. We're in the air flying with a ton of power. We don't have to worry too much about answering our stuff. We want to go aggro. We want to stay aggressive. If you go more landfall, Nesting Dragon can help you a little bit, but we don't have a ton of that. And at that 5 power, it really hits in a weird place that creates small dragons over time. Just not a card I love. Elemental Bond, I swapped out 1 for 1, you'll see. Harbinger of the Hunt, 5 mana, 5/3 flyer. 3 to deal a damage to each creature without flying, 3 to deal a damage to each creature with flying. This is just power crept out of the game, I think, at this point, out of being a super relevant one. Again, 5 power is really frustrating here. I want to hit either 4 or 6, and I want to do it for less than 5 mana if we're going with 4, probably. Steel Hellkite, generically pretty decent, 6 mana, 5 power. I had to make my cuts somewhere, and I didn't love Steel Hellkite here. We have to dump a ton of mana in for this to be relevant, but if it's a pet card of yours, that's not one I'm going to tell you is just a you definitely should cut it, like Harbinger of the Hunt. I just don't like this card. Rapacious Dragon, 5 mana for a 3/3. We don't even get to hit our card draw for this. That's frustrating. Tarian Mauler, y'all look, it's got Changeling. It counts as a dragon, but there are dragons. We don't need to run Changeling in a dragon deck, y'all. There's a lot of Kindred decks that need Changelings and want Tarian Mauler, and Tarian Mauler's pretty strong. I mean, this can get out of hand very quickly if it's not getting answered, but like, if we're running dragons, I don't want to play a bull and be like, technically it's a dragon. I want dragons, and so I run cards like Skargan Hellkite. This was one of my last cuts from the deck, but I did end up chopping it because I think it's a little clunky, and 4 mana to deal 2 damage if we've done this other thing. Very standard-y kind of dragon feel here and not what we want to do. And then Dragon Master Outcast. It doesn't trigger our power stuff. It can create dragons later on down the route. I just want to go with dragons and dragon cards that help us. I told you I cut Elemental Bond 1 for 1. I did it for Garruk's Uprising. If everything has trample on top of everything that we're trying to do, it's just ridiculous. Plus, we're still getting to draw cards. It's off the power 4 instead of the power 3. But we're leaning on the power 4 anyway, so it is what it is. Scourge of Valkus is a 5 mana 4/4, so we're getting to draw a card off this. Whenever it or another dragon enters the battlefield under your control, it deals X damage to target creature or player, where X is the number of dragons you control. You can see what we're trying to do there. Renari, Merchant of Marvels, is a dragon. You can cast dragons as though they've got flash, so all of your dragons now have the F word on them. Pretty insane. Land Ramp. I wanted Land Ramp in this deck, and so we put Rampant Growth and Nature's Lore in here over the 1 mana rock that we cut, but you can see we put some mana rocks in there too. Shh, don't tell Joel. Scaled Nurturer, 2 mana for a mana dork that is also a dragon and also gives us some residual value. The residual value here is not super like game changing, but any residual value on top of it's a dragon that gives us mana, we like that. Dragon Speaker Shaman, you saw some other cards in here that say dragon spells cost less. Dragon Speaker Shaman says they cost 2 less, which is enormous. Thrakus the Butcher is a dragon for 5 mana. It's under the 4. I hate that it's under the 4. I really thought hard about putting this card in the deck, but whenever it attacks, double the power of each dragon you control until end of turn seems really strong, and so I'm going to make an allowance for Thrakus the Butcher. He's a pretty boy. Look how handsome. And I think that even though he doesn't have 4 power, he belongs in the deck. Land Ramp, we talked about. Orb of Dragonkind uses 1 mana to create 2 of any 2 colors to only cast dragons. We love that. And then later on, when we don't need it anymore, we can pay a red, sack it, look at the top 7, get a dragon from among them into our hand. So pretty good value there for a long-running deck and can help us ramp, fix our colors, do a couple different things for us. Ganax Astral Hunter, 5 mana 3/4. When it or another dragon enters the battlefield under our control, create a treasure token. This is a 1-to-1 swap, y'all. I told you, Rapacious Dragon, 5 mana 3/3. When it enters, create 2 treasures. No, I want it entering or another dragon creating treasures every single time. Really love Ganax in here. Corlessa, 2 mana dragon. Look at the top card anytime. Cast dragon spells from the top. You can see why we want that. And then Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind, 3 mana, add a red. And if it goes into a dragon, that dragon gains haste. That's why it's in this deck. There's a dragon orb for every color, but Carnelian specifically does haste, which is just insane when you've got these enormous dragons flying in the air. Ranking these against each other or giving you my recommendations on which ones to buy. The Sultai and the Temur deck have, I think, the most complete experience right out of the box, not touching it whatsoever. Pick your commander carefully and know what you want to be doing based on us talking about their strategies. But I think that either of these are going to play really well right out of the box. And it's funny because I think that they're maybe the most advanced of the deck and the least advanced as far as like gameplay strategy and what it takes to win. Sultai, you're going to need to know some good fundamental mechanics of Magic the Gathering, most likely the least friendly just to pick up and play for a new player, versus Temur Roar, which is probably my recommendation for if you're a newer player just learning Magic. Start here. I mean, this is Magic the Gathering incarnate. Play big dragons, swing with big dragons. Huge. I love it. I also think that the Mardu one I would put third. This has got a pretty good strategy out of the box, but it needs to go fast. It's an aggro deck, and so it could burn out if you don't play it well and make sure that you're balancing losing life when the tokens die with drawing cards when the tokens die so that you can keep your hand full. The Abzan deck feels really complete. However, This is a deck where if you just want to get hated off the table and they want to keep all your pieces that make your toughness matter stuff matter, then you could be sitting there with a bunch of walls and you're like, well, I can't get attacked, but I don't know how to win. And then I've got the Jeskai 1/5. It's not a weak deck by any means, but it does focus a lot on casting spells and dropping prowess creatures on the battlefield. And so I think just because you need to be a little bit more of an advanced player to play this one as well, but it doesn't give you that generic value that Sultai can with like lands onto the battlefield from your graveyard or reanimating creatures. I think it'll give you a little less play if you're not as good at a spellcasting storm strategy, or you're not as aware intricate mechanics of the game to help that deck really function and flourish well. That's my review of the Tarkir Dragonstorm Precons. Let me know down in the comments if you've got any questions about deck building, any clarifications on anything I said. If I got anything wrong, please let me know in the comments. Talked about a lot of cards here, probably misspoke at some point. The conversation continues down there. And if you've watched this far, clicking that subscribe button helps us out so much. You should go jump into our Discord and get involved with our community, and go check out our Patreon and see if you want any of the rewards that you can get for supporting the channel directly. Thanks so much. We'll catch you in the next one.